England, September 1864. The rain had been falling for 3 days without ceasing, turning the roads to rivers of mud and the sky to an oppressive grey that seemed to press down upon the earth itself. Miss Charlotte Abbot stood at the window of the Bramfield Employment Agency, her reflection ghost-like in the water-streaked glass, and wondered with a detachment born of exhaustion whether she would secure a position before her last shilling disappeared entirely. At 24, she had learned that survival required a certain hardening of the heart, a willingness to endure humiliation with grace, to accept whatever circumstances offered without the luxury of pride. The wooden bench beneath her offered no comfort, its surface worn smooth by countless other women who had sat exactly where she sat now, waiting to discover whether their desperation would find an answer or merely deepen into something more terrible. Around her, the agency's modest office smelled of damp wool and despair, though Mrs. Bramfield herself maintained an air of brisk efficiency that suggested she had long ago ceased to be moved by the tragedies that passed through her establishment daily. Charlotte had been waiting since morning, had watched 4 other women called into Mrs. Bramfield's private office for interviews that resulted in either relieved tears or quiet disappointment, and she had tried not to calculate how many days remained before she would be forced to make choices she had promised herself she would never consider. Her navy travelling dress, carefully mended and pressed, spoke of gentility maintained despite reduced circumstances, and her light brown hair was arranged in a simple style that required no lady's maid's assistance, for she had not been able to afford such luxuries in the 18 months since her father's death had revealed the true state of their finances, or rather the complete absence of finances beneath the careful facade of respectability he had maintained for years. The door to the private office opened, and Mrs. Bramfield appeared, her sharp eyes assessing Charlotte with the practiced evaluation of someone who matched women to positions the way others might match horses to carts, considering temperament, training, and the capacity to endure difficult circumstances. "Miss Abbot, if you would step in, please," she said, her voice neither kind nor unkind, merely businesslike. Charlotte rose with the careful grace her mother had drilled into her during childhood, when they had still believed she would make an advantageous marriage before scandal and death had reduced her to this, and she followed Mrs. Bramfield into an office that was surprisingly warm, a small fire burning in the grate despite the expense. "Please sit," Mrs. Bramfield gestured to a chair opposite her cluttered desk, and Charlotte obeyed, her hands folded in her lap to conceal their trembling. The older woman shuffled through papers with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to managing multiple desperate situations simultaneously. "You have references from Mrs. Thornbury, for whom you served as a companion for 6 months following your father's passing," she read aloud, her tone suggesting she was merely confirming facts already known. "She speaks highly of your education, your French and Italian, your musical accomplishments, and your general comportment, though she notes you left her service somewhat suddenly." Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks, for the circumstances of that departure were not something she wished to discuss, but Mrs. Bramfield's steady gaze demanded explanation. "Mrs. Thornbury's eldest son made advances that I could not in good conscience accept," Charlotte said quietly, pride warring with necessity in her chest. "I believed it better to leave than to create a situation that might reflect poorly on the household." Mrs. Bramfield's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of approval crossing her weathered features. "You have more integrity than sense, Miss Abbot, which is admirable but impractical in your situation. Nevertheless, I have a position that might suit you, though I confess the circumstances are unusual and require someone of particular character." She leaned back in her chair, studying Charlotte with an intensity that made her feel as though every secret she possessed was being catalogued and assessed. "I require a governess for Silverbrook Hall in Derbyshire, 2 children, ages 7 and 9, both girls, whose mother died in childbirth 3 years ago and whose father has been largely absent from their upbringing until recently." Charlotte's heart quickened with something that might have been hope if she dared allow herself such dangerous emotions. The position offers £40 per year, room and board, and the opportunity to shape young minds, which I understand from your references is something you value," Mrs. Bramfield continued. "However, I must be direct with you about the complication that has made this position difficult to fill despite generous terms." She paused, choosing her words with visible care. "The master of Silverbrook Hall is His Grace, the Duke of Silverbrook, a man of considerable wealth and standing, but also of certain reputation. He is known to be exacting, cold, and uncompromising in his standards. 3 governesses have left his employ in the past year, though I hasten to add that none have reported impropriety, merely an atmosphere they found intolerable." The words fell into Charlotte's consciousness like stones into still water, creating ripples that threatened to disturb the careful composure she had maintained. Silverbrook, the Duke of Silverbrook. Her mind raced backward through memory, searching for the connection she knew must exist, for the name carried weight beyond mere aristocratic title. And then it struck her with the force of physical blow. Alexander Buxton, Duke of Silverbrook, the man who had courted her 3 years ago with words of poetry and promises of devotion, who had called her his sunlight, his inspiration, his reason for joy, and who had vanished from her life without explanation or farewell when scandal touched her family, when her father's business failures became public knowledge, when she ceased to be an acceptable match for a duke and became instead something to be forgotten quickly and without regret. Charlotte's vision narrowed, and for a moment she thought she might faint, her hands gripping the arms of her chair until her knuckles whitened, but she forced herself to breathe slowly through her nose, to maintain the composure that had become her armour against a world that had proven itself cruel beyond measure. Mrs. Bramfield, observing her reaction with professional concern, leaned forward. "Miss Abbot, are you quite well? You've gone rather pale." The practical necessity of survival warred with every instinct Charlotte possessed that screamed at her to refuse, to flee, to accept any fate but this one that would force her to live under his roof, to see him daily, to pretend indifference while her heart remembered every wound he had inflicted. But practicality, cold and merciless, reminded her that she had 17 shillings remaining to her name, that no other positions had materialised despite months of searching, that winter approached with its increased expenses for fuel and warmer clothing she did not possess. She could not afford the luxury of pride, could not allow old Heartbreak to dictate present necessity. "Forgive me," Charlotte managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "A momentary dizziness. The close atmosphere, perhaps." Mrs. Bramfield's eyes narrowed slightly, suggesting she suspected more than physical discomfort, but she did not press. "Shall I take it you wish to accept the position? I can arrange for your travel to Derbyshire within the week." Every rational part of Charlotte's mind catalogued reasons to refuse, to explain that she could not possibly work for a man who had broken promises with such casual cruelty, who had demonstrated so completely that her worth to him had been conditional upon her social standing. But her voice, independent of her wishes, heard itself say, "Yes, I accept." Mrs. Bramfield nodded with satisfaction and began pulling papers from various files, her movements suggesting the matter was now settled and required only administrative completion. "Excellent. You'll find the Duke expects absolute professionalism, punctuality, and dedication to his daughter's education. The girls, Lady Catherine and Lady Margaret, are by all accounts bright but somewhat wilful, having lacked consistent maternal guidance. Your predecessor left quite suddenly, citing the remote location and the Duke's demanding nature as incompatible with her constitution." She handed Charlotte several documents requiring signature. "You'll depart Monday morning on the mail coach to Derby, where the Silverbrook carriage will meet you for the final leg of the journey. I suggest you prepare yourself mentally for the isolation, Miss Abbot. Silverbrook Hall is magnificent but quite removed from society, which suits the Duke's preferences but can be trying for those accustomed to more stimulating environments. Charlotte signed her name with fingers that had ceased trembling, achieving a calm she did not feel, and accepted the sheaf of papers Mrs. Bramfield provided, instructions and letters of introduction that would transform her officially from Miss Charlotte Abbot, gentleman's daughter, to Miss Abbot, governess, a shift in identity that felt both liberating and devastating in equal measure. As she emerged from the agency into rain that showed no signs of abating, Charlotte allowed herself one moment of complete honesty with her situation. She would see Alexander Buxton again, the man who had kissed her in moonlit gardens and whispered that she was his future, who had made her believe in love's transformative power, and who had demonstrated with his silence that such beliefs were naive constructions that dissolved the moment circumstances tested them. She would live in his home, dependent upon his continued employment, subject to his authority, forced to be grateful for his condescension in providing her position. The humiliation of it threatened to overwhelm her, but Charlotte had learned over 18 months of poverty and desperation that survival required swallowing emotions that served no practical purpose. She would endure this because she had no alternative, would face him with dignity because she refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing how completely he had destroyed her capacity for trust, would teach his daughters with dedication because children deserved education regardless of their father's character. And if some nights she wept for the girl she had been, who had believed in love and promises and the fundamental goodness of well-spoken men, no one need know, for tears dried and hearts hardened and life continued with its relentless demands, regardless of personal anguish. Monday arrived with unseasonable cold, frost etching patterns on windows and breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Charlotte stood at the coaching inn with a single trunk containing everything she owned, waiting as the mail coach prepared to depart, and she did not look back at London as the city disappeared behind them, for there was nothing there she wished to remember, no one who would miss her, no life worth preserving in memory. The journey north took 2 full days, the coach stopping at posting inns where Charlotte spent her dwindling funds on the cheapest meals available and slept in shared rooms with other women whose circumstances she could only guess at, but whose eyes reflected familiar desperation. She spoke to no one beyond necessary courtesies, unwilling to form even temporary connections that might require explanations about her destination or employment, and she used the long hours of travel to construct the mental armour she would need to face Alexander with apparent indifference. By the time the coach reached Derby on the 3rd morning, Charlotte felt hollowed out by travel and apprehension, her body aching from the uncomfortable seats and her mind exhausted from rehearsing conversations she knew she would never actually have. The Silverbrook carriage awaited her exactly as Mrs. Bramfield had promised, a magnificent vehicle of deep blue lacquer emblazoned with a ducal crest that made Charlotte's stomach clench with recognition. The coachman, an elderly man with kind eyes, helped her into the plush interior with deference that seemed excessive for a governess, and she wondered whether he had been told anything about her history with his employer, whether the servants knew she had once been courted by the Duke before poverty made her unsuitable. The final leg of the journey carried them through countryside of stunning beauty, rolling hills giving way to dramatic peaks, forests of ancient oak and ash, stone walls dividing fields where sheep grazed in contented clusters, and Charlotte felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the wildness of it, the sense that here nature cared nothing for human hierarchies or social standing, existed independent of the judgments that had defined her recent life. As the carriage rounded a final curve, Silverbrook Hall revealed itself with dramatic suddenness. A Palladian masterpiece of honey-coloured stone set against autumn-bright hills, its proportions speaking of wealth accumulated over centuries, its windows reflecting afternoon sun in countless panes that suggested rooms beyond counting. Charlotte's breath caught, despite her determination to remain unmoved, for the house was magnificent, in a way that made her father's former residence seem almost shabby by comparison, and she understood with sudden clarity the vast distance that had always existed between her circumstances and Alexander's. The foolishness of ever believing their match had been anything but his temporary amusement before he returned to his proper sphere. The carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance, and Charlotte forced herself to breathe slowly as a footman opened the door and offered his hand to assist her descent. The household staff stood assembled in formal rows, their faces professional and assessing, and Charlotte felt their collective judgment as she approached, wondering what they saw, whether they knew anything of her past connection to their master, whether her presence represented merely another in a series of governesses who would prove inadequate to the Duke's standards. Mrs. Harrison, the housekeeper, stepped forward with the authoritative bearing of someone who had managed great households for decades, her steel-grey hair arranged beneath a pristine cap, her black dress speaking of dignity and unquestionable competence. "Miss Abbot, welcome to Silverbrook Hall. I trust your journey was not too taxing." Her voice carried the cultured accent of an upper servant, neither subservient nor presumptuous. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison," Charlotte replied, her own voice steady despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. The journey was quite comfortable. Mrs. Harrison's shrewd eyes assessed Charlotte with the same thorough evaluation Mrs. Bramfield had employed, though perhaps with more sympathy. "His Grace is currently in London attending to parliamentary business and is not expected to return for several days, which will allow you time to settle into your quarters and meet the young ladies before undertaking their formal education." Charlotte felt relief flood through her with such intensity that her knees weakened slightly, for she had not known how she would manage seeing Alexander immediately, had not prepared herself adequately for that first encounter. The reprieve, however temporary, felt like mercy. "The children are eager to meet you," Mrs. Harrison continued, gesturing for Charlotte to follow her into the house's magnificent entrance hall, where marble floors gleamed beneath elaborate plasterwork ceilings and ancestral portraits gazed down with expressions of aristocratic certainty. "Lady Catherine and Lady Margaret have been without consistent instruction for several weeks since Miss Blackwell departed rather suddenly. I hope you will find them tractable, though I confess they have developed certain wild tendencies in the absence of firm guidance." They climbed a grand staircase to the second floor, then continued up more modest stairs to the third floor where the nursery and schoolroom occupied a sunny wing overlooking the gardens. The governess's room, adjacent to the schoolroom, was far more comfortable than Charlotte had anticipated, furnished with a proper bed, a writing desk, a comfortable chair near the fireplace, and windows that framed spectacular views of the Derbyshire hills. "His Grace believes that education requires not only knowledge, but also comfort conducive to study," Mrs. Harrison explained, observing Charlotte's surprise at the room's amenities. "You'll find the schoolroom equally well appointed with books, maps, musical instruments, and whatever materials you require for the young lady's instruction. You need only submit requests through me, and His Grace will ensure prompt provision." The mention of Alexander sent Charlotte's stomach churning again, reminding her that his provision of comfort came with expectations of excellence, that he would judge her performance as governess with the same exacting standards he applied to everything, that failure would result in dismissal and the destruction of any future prospects, for who would employ a governess dismissed by a duke? "I should like to meet Lady Catherine and Lady Margaret now, if that is convenient," Charlotte said, needing activity to distract from the anxiety building in her chest. Mrs. Harrison smiled approvingly. "They are in the nursery awaiting introduction. I must warn you, Miss Abbot, that they have developed a tendency to test new governesses rather thoroughly. The previous occupants of your position found their spirited nature challenging." The nursery occupied rooms that surprised Charlotte with their warmth and evident care, toys and books arranged neatly on shelves, comfortable furniture positioned to catch afternoon light, walls painted in cheerful colours rather than the institutional whites she had expected. Two girls stood as Charlotte entered. their faces reflecting curiosity mixed with wariness, born of watching governesses arrive and depart with regularity. Lady Catherine, the elder at 9, possessed her father's dark hair and striking grey eyes, her bearing already showing hints of the aristocratic confidence she would carry into adulthood, while Lady Margaret, 7, was fairer with honey-coloured curls and a more delicate constitution that suggested their deceased mother's influence. Lady Catherine, Lady Margaret, this is Miss Abbot, your new governess, Mrs. Harrison announced with formality. I trust you will extend her every courtesy and cooperation. Charlotte curtsied appropriately to the Duke's daughters, maintaining the proper deference to rank, even though they were children. I am pleased to make your acquaintances, and I look forward to our studies together. Catherine studied Charlotte with disconcerting directness, her grey eyes so reminiscent of Alexander's that Charlotte felt her breath catch. Are you going to leave like all the others? The girl asked bluntly. Papa says governesses are unreliable, that they promise dedication and deliver disappointment. The words, clearly echoing things the child had overheard, cut deeper than Charlotte suspected Catherine intended, for they revealed Alexander's perspective on female constancy, his belief that women could not be trusted to maintain commitment when difficulties arose. The irony of hearing such sentiments from the man who had abandoned her without explanation was not lost on Charlotte, though she maintained her composure with effort. I have no intention of leaving, Lady Catherine, Charlotte replied with quiet firmness. I believe education is among the most important responsibilities adults can undertake, and I am committed to ensuring both you and your sister receive instruction worthy of your intelligence and potential. Margaret, emboldened by Charlotte's steady response, spoke for the first time in a voice that trembled slightly with hope. Miss Blackwell said she would stay forever, but she left after Papa shouted at her for letting me spoil my dress in the garden. Will you leave if Papa shouts? Charlotte knelt so that she was at eye level with both girls, her navy dress pooling around her on the nursery floor. Your father has every right to expect certain standards of care and education. However, I have weathered far more substantial storms than a duke's displeasure, and I assure you that my commitment to your well-being will not waver, regardless of circumstances. Something in her tone, perhaps the underlying steel born of genuine hardship, seemed to reach the children in a way previous governesses' cheerful promises had not. Catherine's expression softened marginally, and Margaret moved closer with tentative trust. Can you teach us interesting things? Catherine asked. Miss Blackwell only made us do needlework and recite Bible verses. It was dreadfully dull. Charlotte smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had felt since accepting this position. I can teach you mathematics and geography, history and literature, French and Italian, music and art, and most importantly, I can teach you to think critically about the world and your place within it. Education should challenge your minds, not simply prepare you for drawing-room accomplishments. Mrs. Harrison, observing this exchange with obvious approval, cleared her throat gently. I shall leave you to become acquainted. Miss Abbot, dinner is served in the schoolroom at 6 o'clock for you and the young ladies. If you require anything, ring for a maid. She departed with a swish of black skirts, leaving Charlotte alone with her charges, and for the first time since accepting this impossible position, Charlotte felt something other than dread. For here were two children who needed her, whose education she could influence, whose lives she might improve regardless of her complicated history with their father. The following days established a routine that Charlotte found unexpectedly satisfying, despite the sword of Alexander's eventual return hanging over every moment. She rose at dawn, took her simple breakfast in the schoolroom, and prepared lessons that challenged the girls' quick minds while gradually revealing the gaps in their previous instruction. Catherine possessed remarkable mathematical aptitude and a voracious appetite for historical narratives, while Margaret showed artistic talent and a sensitivity to literature that moved Charlotte with its depth. They studied Latin declensions in the morning, practiced French conversation over lunch, explored geography through map-making in the afternoon, and ended each day with music, Charlotte playing the pianoforte while the girls sang with increasingly confident voices. In the evenings after the children slept, Charlotte sat at her desk writing lesson plans and trying not to think about the week's end when Alexander would return, when she would be forced to face him for the first time in 3 years, when she would discover whether he even remembered the woman he had courted so ardently before discarding so completely. Mrs. Harrison proved an unexpected ally, checking on Charlotte's welfare daily and ensuring she had everything necessary for effective teaching. And Charlotte gradually understood that the housekeeper had watched previous governesses fail and was actively hoping Charlotte would succeed where others had faltered. "You have a gift with the young ladies," Mrs. Harrison observed one afternoon, finding Charlotte in the library selecting books for the following week's literature lessons. "Lady Catherine has not been this engaged in her studies since before her mother died, and Lady Margaret's nightmares have ceased entirely since your arrival." Charlotte felt warmth spread through her chest at this confirmation that her efforts mattered, that despite the uncomfortable circumstances of her employment, she was accomplishing something worthwhile. "They are remarkable children who have needed consistent attention and genuine challenge. I am grateful for the opportunity to provide both." Mrs. Harrison's expression grew thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Forgive my forwardness, Miss Abbot, but I sense you carry some burden that weighs upon you beyond the usual anxieties of a new position. If there is anything I might do to ease your transition, please know that I am disposed to help." For a moment, Charlotte considered confiding in this kind woman, explaining the cruel coincidence that had brought her to Silverbrook, but pride and fear of judgment sealed her lips. "You are very kind, Mrs. Harrison, but I assure you I am quite well. Merely focused on ensuring I meet His Grace's standards when he returns." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly, suggesting she suspected more than Charlotte revealed, but she did not press. "His Grace can be exacting, but he is fundamentally fair. If you demonstrate dedication and competence, you will find him a reasonable employer." Charlotte nodded, though she doubted Alexander's fairness extended to women who might remind him of past indiscretions or uncomfortable emotions he preferred to keep buried. Friday arrived with the inexorability of tide, bringing with it the knowledge that Alexander was expected to return by evening. Charlotte spent the day in a state of controlled anxiety, maintaining normal lessons for the girls while her mind raced through potential scenarios, rehearsing responses to questions he might ask, preparing herself to maintain absolute professionalism, regardless of what memories his presence might resurrect. She dressed for dinner with particular care that evening, selecting the best of her limited wardrobe, a grey wool dress that was serviceable rather than elegant but clean and well-maintained, her hair arranged in the simple style that had become habitual, and she examined her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand, wondering what he would see when he looked at her, whether he would recognize the girl he had courted or see only the governess she had become. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel sent Charlotte's heart racing, and she gripped the edge of her desk until the moment passed, breathing slowly until composure returned. She would not hide, would not give him the power to reduce her to trembling inadequacy. She was Miss Abbot now, governess to his daughters, a position she had earned through her qualifications and would maintain through her competence, and whatever history existed between them was irrelevant to her current duties. A knock at her door made her start despite her mental preparations. A young maid entered with expression of nervous excitement. "Miss Abbot, His Grace has arrived and requests your presence in his study immediately to discuss the young lady's progress and your plans for their continued education." Charlotte's composure wavered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Thank you. Please inform His Grace I shall attend him directly." She descended the stairs with measured steps, her hands steady through sheer force of will, and she paused outside the study door to gather herself one final time before knocking. "Enter," came the voice she had heard in dreams and nightmares for 3 years, deeper than she remembered but unmistakably his, and Charlotte opened the door to face the man who had broken her heart and now held her future in his aristocratic hands. Alexander Buxton, Duke of Silverbrook, stood with his back to the door, studying papers at his desk, and for a moment Charlotte could observe him unnoticed, cataloguing changes that 3 years had wrought. He seemed taller somehow, his shoulders broader in the perfectly tailored coat, his dark hair touched with early silver at the temples that lent him gravitas beyond his 32 years. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, Charlotte saw new lines around his eyes that spoke of burdens carried and perhaps sleepless nights endured. Their eyes met across the study's opulent space, and Charlotte watched recognition dawn in his expression, saw shock and something that might have been pain flash across features schooled to aristocratic impassivity. And for 3 heartbeats, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them like a chasm filled with everything that had been said, and more that had been left unspoken. "Miss Abbot," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled though Charlotte heard the tremor beneath. "I was not informed that the agency had sent you specifically." Charlotte curtsied with the proper deference a governess owed a duke, though the gesture cost her more than he could possibly know. "Your Grace, I trust my credentials meet your requirements." Mrs. Bramfield spoke highly of the position, and I was grateful for the opportunity. Alexander moved from behind his desk, his grey eyes never leaving her face, and Charlotte saw confusion wearing with something darker in his expression. "Charlotte," he began, then stopped himself, recognizing perhaps that such familiarity was no longer appropriate given their changed circumstances. "Miss Abbot, I must confess to considerable surprise at finding you here. When we last, that is to say, I had understood your family remained in London." The oblique reference to their shared past hung between them, and Charlotte felt anger kindle in her chest, hot and clarifying. He dared to reference their history as though it were some minor social connection rather than the devastation of her every hope and dream. "Circumstances change, Your Grace," she replied with icy precision. "My father's death 18 months ago left me in reduced circumstances that necessitated seeking employment. The agency offered this position, and I accepted. If my presence creates difficulty, I can of course tender my resignation immediately." Something flashed in Alexander's eyes that looked almost like panic, quickly suppressed. "That will not be necessary. Mrs. Harrison's reports on your work with Catherine and Margaret have been exceptional. The girls are thriving under your instruction in ways they did not with previous governesses." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I merely wish to ensure that previous acquaintance does not create awkwardness that might impact your ability to fulfill your duties." Charlotte met his gaze directly, pride demanding she not reveal how deeply his presence affected her. "I am entirely capable of separating personal history from professional responsibility, Your Grace. My commitment is to Lady Catherine and Lady Margaret's education. Nothing more." The words established boundaries with surgical precision, making clear that whatever had existed between them was dead, that she had no expectations beyond her employment, that he need not fear emotional complications from a governess who
knew her place. Alexander nodded slowly, though his expression suggested her words had landed with more impact than she intended. "Then we understand each other. I expect daily reports on the children's progress, and I wish to observe lessons periodically to ensure standards are maintained."
Over the following weeks, an uncomfortable routine established itself at Silverbrook Hall. Charlotte maintained her dedication to the girls' education, watching with satisfaction as their knowledge expanded and their confidence grew, and she avoided Alexander whenever possible, timing her movements through the house to minimize encounters, taking meals in the schoolroom rather than risking awkward meetings in corridors. When observation of lessons became necessary, she endured his presence with professional composure, explaining her pedagogical approaches while ignoring the way his gaze seemed to linger on her face as though searching for something he had lost, and only now recognized as precious. The children, perceptive as children always were, sensed the tension between their father and their governess, though they could not name its source, and Margaret asked one evening whether Miss Abbot and Papa had quarrelled, for they seemed so careful never to speak to each other beyond absolute necessity. Charlotte assured her that no quarrel existed, that the Duke was simply a busy man with many responsibilities, and that governesses and employers naturally maintained appropriate professional distance, and she hoped the girl believed the lie, for Charlotte herself barely could. One afternoon in late October, Catherine fell while exploring the gardens and returned to the schoolroom with a badly scraped knee and torn dress, crying with pain and embarrassment. Charlotte cleaned the wound with gentle efficiency, soothed the child's distress with calm words, and changed her into fresh clothing, never imagining that Alexander had witnessed the entire incident from his study window. That evening he appeared at the schoolroom door as Charlotte prepared the next day's lessons, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying unmistakable emotion. "Miss Abbot, might I have a word?" Charlotte rose from her desk with carefully maintained composure. "Of course, Your Grace. I hope you found today's geography lessons satisfactory." Lady Catherine demonstrated excellent understanding of map projections. Alexander waved away the professional deflection with visible impatience. "I did not come to discuss geography. I watched you with Catherine today when she injured herself. You showed her tenderness and care that went beyond duty, and she responded with trust she has not shown since her mother died." He moved further into the room, his movements betraying agitation beneath his controlled exterior. "I must ask you directly, Charlotte, because this situation has become intolerable for reasons that have nothing to do with your competence, which is beyond question. Why did you accept this position knowing you would have to face me? Surely you must have seen my name and known." Charlotte felt 3 years of suppressed pain and anger rising like floodwater against a failing dam. "Must have known what, Your Grace?" "That the Duke of Silverbrook was the Alexander Buxton who courted me with pretty words and promises before vanishing the moment scandal touched my family. I confess I did not make the connection until Mrs. Bramfield mentioned your full name and title, and by then I had precisely 17 shillings to my name and winter approaching. So yes, I knew, and I accepted anyway because survival is not a luxury I can afford to compromise through wounded pride." Her voice broke slightly on the final words, betraying the emotion she had worked so hard to conceal, and Alexander's face crumpled as though she had struck him physically. "Charlotte, I never meant that is. You must understand that my circumstances, my family, the expectations of my position." He stopped, seeming to realize how inadequate the explanations sounded even as he offered them. "I was a coward. There is no other word for it, and I have spent 3 years regretting my cowardice while lacking the courage to attempt amends." Charlotte laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humour. "Amends? What amends could possibly address 3 years of silence? You disappeared, Alexander. One day you were declaring your devotion, and the next you were simply gone. No explanation, no farewell, nothing. Do you have any conception of what that did to me? I spent months wondering whether I had imagined your regard, whether every word you spoke had been calculated falsehood, whether I possessed so little worth that you could discard me without even the courtesy of an honest goodbye." Tears threatened now, and Charlotte turned away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But Alexander moved closer, his voice rough with emotion she could not name. "You possessed more worth than I deserved to touch. That was the problem, Charlotte. When your father's situation became known, my family, particularly my uncle who managed my affairs at the time, insisted I distance myself immediately. They said a duke could not marry scandal, could not ally himself with financial disgrace, regardless of personal inclination. I was weak, and I was afraid, and I convinced myself that sacrificing my happiness and yours was the price of maintaining my position. He paused, and Charlotte heard him draw a shaking breath. I told myself you would recover, that you would find someone worthy of you, that time would heal what I had broken. I never imagined you would end up here, in my home, forced to accept employment from the man who destroyed your prospects. Charlotte turned back to face him, her grey-blue eyes meeting his with fierce honesty. You did not destroy my prospects, Alexander. Poverty did that quite thoroughly on its own, but you destroyed something far more precious. You destroyed my capacity to trust that anyone's regard for me was genuine, rather than conditional upon my circumstances. You confirmed every fear I ever harboured, that I was insufficient, that my worth existed only in relation to what I could offer socially or financially. Her voice dropped to barely above whisper. I loved you completely, and you taught me that love meant nothing against the calculus of social standing. The words hung between them, raw and irreversible, and Alexander's face showed such genuine anguish that Charlotte felt something crack in her chest, despite her determination to remain unmoved. I loved you too, he said hoarsely. I have never stopped loving you, though I know I forfeited any right to claim such feelings. Watching you these past weeks, seeing your dedication to my daughters, your intelligence and grace, your strength that has only deepened through hardship, I understand what I lost, what I threw away through cowardice masquerading as duty. Charlotte felt the foundations of her carefully constructed defences beginning to crumble, and panic seized her, for she could not afford to be vulnerable to this man again, could not risk the destruction that would follow if she allowed hope to take root, only to have it torn away once more. What you lost is irrelevant, Your Grace, she said, forcing her voice to steady. I am your employee now, nothing more. Whatever feelings existed between us died 3 years ago through your neglect, and I have no interest in resurrecting them. She moved toward the door, needing escape from his presence and the emotions it stirred, but Alexander's next words stopped her. I released my uncle's control of my affairs 2 years ago, when I reached my majority for managing the estates independently. I am no longer subject to anyone's dictates about whom I may or may not care for. If I had possessed that freedom 3 years ago, Charlotte, I would have married you regardless of scandal or reduced circumstances, and I would have counted myself fortunate beyond measure. Charlotte turned slowly, searching his face for deception and finding only naked honesty. But you did not have that freedom then. And I am not the naive girl who believed in fairy tales anymore. I am a governess whose future depends upon your continued employment. That is not a foundation for anything beyond professional obligation. Alexander nodded, acceptance and defeat mingling in his expression. You are absolutely correct. I merely wanted you to know the truth, however inadequate it may be. I will not press you further, will not make your position here uncomfortable through unwelcome attention. You have my word that I will maintain appropriate distance and treat you with the respect you should have received from the beginning. He departed then, leaving Charlotte standing in the schoolroom with tears finally falling unchecked, mourning not what had been lost, for that was long dead, but what might have been if he had possessed the courage to choose her when it mattered, if she had not been forced to learn that love was insufficient currency against the demands of rank and duty. She wept for the girl she had been, who had believed in romance and redemption, and for the woman she had become, who knew that survival required harder lessons than the heart wished to learn. The weeks that followed were marked by scrupulous politeness and careful distance, Alexander keeping his word to maintain professional boundaries while Charlotte threw herself into the girls' education with renewed intensity, finding in their progress distraction from the complicated emotions his confession had stirred. Catherine and Margaret thrived under her consistent attention, their knowledge expanding daily, their confidence growing as they mastered Latin conjugations and mathematical theorems, historical timelines, and literary analysis. And Charlotte felt satisfaction in watching them become the intelligent, thoughtful young women their potential promised. December arrived with snow transforming Derbyshire into a landscape of breathtaking beauty, and the approach of Christmas required Charlotte to plan educational activities that acknowledged the season while maintaining academic rigour. She organised a study of winter solstice celebrations across cultures, had the girls compose poetry about snow and cold, taught them carols in French and Italian, and watched their excitement build as the holiday approached. On Christmas Eve, Alexander requested Charlotte's presence in his study, and she descended the stairs with trepidation, uncertain what this summons portended. She found him standing before the fire, his expression uncertain but determined, and when he turned at her entrance, she saw vulnerability in his eyes that she had never witnessed during their courtship. "Miss Abbot, thank you for attending me. I have something I wish to give you, not as employer to Governess, but as someone who owes you a debt that can never truly be repaid." He withdrew a small leather portfolio from his desk and handed it to her with hands that trembled slightly. "I have established a trust in your name, managed by solicitors independent of my influence, that will provide you with £200 per year for life. Before you object," he continued quickly as Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, "this is not payment for your work as governess, which you are compensated for separately, nor is it an attempt to purchase forgiveness or manipulate your feelings. It is simply recognition that I caused you harm through my abandonment, that my cowardice cost you security and peace of mind, and that I wish to ensure you never again face the desperation that brought you to this position." Charlotte stared at the legal documents with mounting confusion and something dangerous that felt like hope struggling to life, despite her best efforts to suppress it. "Alexander, I cannot accept this. The impropriety alone would be ruinous if it became known." He shook his head firmly. "The trust is structured to appear as though it comes from a distant relative's estate, not from me directly. Your reputation will remain unblemished, and you will have independence regardless of whether you choose to remain at Silverbrook or seek other opportunities. I want you to have choices, Charlotte, the choices I took from you 3 years ago." The generosity of the gesture, the clear thought and planning it represented, threatened to undo Charlotte's careful emotional control. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why offer this when maintaining distance would be easier?" Alexander moved closer, though he maintained respectful space between them. "Because watching you these past months, seeing your strength and grace and dedication, has made me understand what I truly lost. Not merely a beautiful woman, though you are beautiful beyond my capacity to express, but a partner who would have challenged me to be better than I was, who would have valued substance over status, who would have loved me for myself rather than my title." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "And because I cannot bear the thought of you staying at Silverbrook only because you have no alternative, of you being trapped by necessity in a position that must cause you daily pain. If you choose to leave, I will understand and will ensure excellent references. If you choose to stay, it should be because you wish to continue the girl's education, not because you fear poverty." Charlotte felt tears gathering again, touched by the consideration behind his offer even as she struggled with the complicated emotions it stirred. "The girls need me," she said finally. "I cannot abandon their education midway through the year regardless of personal discomfort, and I find that working with them brings me genuine satisfaction that has nothing to do with my feelings about their father." Alexander's expression showed relief, mixed with something that might have been disappointment. "Then you will stay? At least through the end of the school year?" Charlotte nodded slowly. "I will stay, though I maintain that accepting such a gift from you crosses boundaries that should remain firmly established." He smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since arriving at Silverbrook. Then, consider it payment of a debt rather than a gift. I have owed you amends for 3 years, Charlotte. Please allow me at least this small measure of restitution. That night, lying in her comfortable bed in the governess's quarters, Charlotte examined the trust documents by candlelight and allowed herself to feel the profound relief that financial security brought. Whatever happened between her and Alexander, whatever complicated emotions remained unresolved, she would never again face the desperation that had brought her to Silverbrook. She had choices now, freedom to determine her own path, and the knowledge that at least one person understood the cost of his choices and had attempted, however imperfectly, to make amends. Spring arrived at Silverbrook with dramatic beauty. Hillsides erupting in wildflowers and lambs appearing in the fields, birdsong filling the early mornings with complexity that seemed almost orchestrated. Charlotte had been at Silverbrook for 7 months, and in that time she had witnessed Catherine and Margaret's transformation from somewhat wild, inconsistently educated children into young ladies of genuine learning and thoughtful character. Catherine's mathematical abilities had progressed to the point where Charlotte struggled to stay ahead of her inquiries, and Margaret's artistic talents had developed sufficiently that her watercolours of the Derbyshire landscape possessed real merit. But beyond their academic achievements, the girls had blossomed emotionally, secure in Charlotte's consistent affection and high expectations, and she knew with bittersweet certainty that this work, this relationship with these children, represented something profoundly meaningful, regardless of the complicated circumstances that had brought her here. Alexander's presence in her life had shifted subtly since Christmas, no longer marked by careful avoidance but by cautious friendship. He joined them occasionally for afternoon lessons, contributing his own knowledge of history and classical languages, and Charlotte watched him interact with his daughters with patience and genuine interest that suggested he was attempting to repair relationships damaged by years of absence. In the evenings, after the girls slept, Charlotte sometimes found herself in the library selecting books for lessons, and Alexander, if present, would offer recommendations or engage her in discussions of philosophy and literature that reminded her painfully of their courtship, when such intellectual companionship had been among the things she valued most about their connection. One warm April evening, as Charlotte stood in the library examining a volume of Wordsworth's poetry, Alexander entered and paused in the doorway, watching her with expression she could not quite interpret. "You have given my daughters something I could not," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the book-lined space. "You have given them the sense that they are valued for their minds and characters, rather than merely their positions. Catherine told me yesterday that she wishes to study mathematics at university if such becomes possible for women. That ambition exists because you taught her to dream beyond the limitations society imposes." Charlotte turned to face him, the book still in her hands. The girls possess extraordinary potential that required only nurturing. Any competent teacher would have achieved similar results. Alexander shook his head, moving closer. "That is not true, and you know it. Previous governesses taught accomplishments. You taught them to think, to question, to value their own judgment. That is revolutionary, Charlotte, and it comes from your own character rather than any pedagogical technique." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I have watched you transform my daughters' lives, watched you bring joy and purpose to this house that has known too much sorrow, and I find myself wondering whether you might consider, whether there might be possibility for us to rebuild what I destroyed." Charlotte's breath caught, hope and fear wearing in her chest. "Alexander, what exactly are you suggesting?" He moved closer still, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his grey eyes, the uncertainty that made him more human than the distant duke he typically projected. "I am suggesting asking really whether you might be willing to consider me again, not as employer to Governess, but as a man who has loved you consistently despite his failures, who has spent 3 years understanding what he lost, who wishes desperately for the opportunity to prove himself worthy of your regard. Charlotte's hands tightened on the poetry volume until her knuckles whitened. You cannot simply erase 3 years of pain with pretty words, Alexander. You broke promises, destroyed trust, demonstrated that your love was conditional upon circumstances beyond my control. How can I possibly trust that you would not do so again if some new scandal or social pressure arose? He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took the book from her hands, setting it aside before taking her fingers gently in his. You cannot trust that. Not yet. Trust must be earned through sustained action over time, and I have barely begun that work. But I am asking you to give me the opportunity to earn it, to prove through daily choice that I have changed, that the man I am now would choose you over status, love over duty, genuine partnership over social approval. His thumbs traced, gentle circles on the backs of her hands. I know I have no right to ask this. I know I deserve your refusal. But Charlotte, these 7 months of seeing you daily, watching you with my children, engaging your brilliant mind, have made me understand that I will spend my life regretting my cowardice if I do not at least attempt to make amends and seek possibility of something more. Charlotte felt tears gathering despite her efforts at control. I cannot endure being hurt like that again, Alexander. I have rebuilt myself from the ruins you created, have found strength I did not know I possessed. I cannot risk that person's destruction by trusting you prematurely. Alexander nodded, acceptance and determination mingling in his expression. Then I will not ask for trust yet. I ask only that you remain at Silverbrook, continue teaching Catherine and Margaret, and allow me to demonstrate through action, rather than words, that I have become someone worthy of your eventual consideration. No pressure, no expectations, simply the opportunity to prove myself over time. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. Stay, Charlotte. Not for me, but for yourself, for the girls, for the work that clearly brings you satisfaction. And if in time you find you can trust me again, I will count myself the most fortunate man in England. Charlotte searched his face, looking for deception or manipulation, and finding only honest vulnerability. The trust he asked for was not something she could offer, not yet, perhaps not ever. But the opportunity to continue work she found meaningful. To watch Catherine and Margaret grow into the remarkable women their potential promised. To exist in financial security while determining her own future, that she could accept. I will stay through the end of the year, she said carefully. Beyond that, I make no promises. And whatever develops or does not develop between us, my primary commitment remains to the children's education. Relief flooded Alexander's expression. I ask nothing more. Thank you, Charlotte, for staying, for caring for my daughters, for giving me this chance, however tentative. Over the following months, Alexander proved his commitment through consistent action rather than grand gestures, respecting Charlotte's boundaries while demonstrating genuine change. He defended her pedagogical choices when his mother criticized them as too intellectual for girls. He established a scholarship fund for girls' education in Derbyshire in Charlotte's name, and most significantly, he trusted her judgment and expertise rather than asserting aristocratic authority. Charlotte watched these changes with cautious hope, seeing a man who had learned from his failures and was actively working to become someone better. And she felt the icy protection around her heart beginning to thaw despite her determination to remain guarded. In September, as the anniversary of Charlotte's arrival at Silverbrook approached, Catherine and Margaret planned a surprise celebration, decorating the schoolroom with drawings and flowers, preparing a program of recitations and musical performances showcasing what they had learned. Alexander joined the celebration, and when the girls had finished their presentations, he produced a small package wrapped in silver paper and handed it to Charlotte with expression of nervous hope. Inside was a first edition of Wuthering Heights, Charlotte's favourite novel, inscribed with words that made her breath catch. To Charlotte, who taught my daughters to value their minds and taught me to value what matters most. With profound gratitude and deepening affection, Alexander. Charlotte looked up from the inscription to find him watching her with such vulnerable hope that something inside her chest cracked open fully for the first time since her arrival. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the book to her chest. "This is extraordinarily thoughtful." That evening, after the children slept, Charlotte found Alexander in the library, standing before the fire with glass of wine and expression of contemplative solitude. "Might I join you?" she asked from the doorway, and he turned with surprise and pleasure mingling on his face. "Always," he replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the fire crackling and casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls, before Charlotte spoke with careful honesty. "I have been thinking about what you said in the spring about rebuilding trust through sustained action. I believe you have demonstrated genuine change, Alexander. You have respected my boundaries, valued my work, shown commitment to becoming a better father and a better man. I find myself wondering whether trust might be possible. After all." Alexander's expression transformed with hope so naked it made Charlotte's throat tighten. "Do you truly mean that?" She nodded slowly. "I do. Not complete trust, not yet. But enough to consider that what was broken might eventually be repaired, that what was lost might be found again in different form." Alexander set down his wine and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his with reverent care. "Charlotte, I love you. I have loved you through 3 years of separation and 7 months of proximity. I will spend my life proving worthy of your trust if you will grant me the opportunity. Marry me, not as governess to duke, but as partner to partner, as equal to equal. Let me give you the future I should have offered 3 years ago." Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who had hurt her so profoundly and who had worked so genuinely to change, to become worthy of second chances. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you, though I warn you that I am not the naive girl I was. I am stronger now, more certain of my own worth, less willing to compromise my principles for social approval." He smiled through his own tears. "I would not want you any other way. The woman you have become is precisely the woman I wish to spend my life beside, challenging me, inspiring me, showing me what truly matters." Their kiss was tender and healing, sealing promises made not in the careless certainty of youth, but in the hard-won wisdom of experience and growth. When they parted, Charlotte said with gentle firmness, "I will continue teaching Catherine and Margaret after we marry. I will not abandon them, nor will I surrender work that brings me such satisfaction." Alexander's smile deepened. "I expected nothing less, and I would not ask it of you. We will be partners in all things, Charlotte, including the education and raising of our daughters." In December, they married in the small chapel at Silverbrook, surrounded by servants who had watched their complicated journey, and the girls who beamed with joy at gaining the mother figure they had come to love. And as Charlotte spoke her vows, she understood with profound clarity that some stories required pain and separation before arriving at earned happiness, that second chances given wisely could heal what first chances destroyed. The years that followed brought Charlotte fulfillment she had not dared imagine during those desperate days in the employment agency, for she and Alexander built a partnership based on genuine respect and shared values, and together they transformed Silverbrook into a centre for girls' education, establishing a school that welcomed students regardless of financial circumstances. Catherine and Margaret grew into remarkable women who valued learning and independence, and Charlotte's own daughters, born in the years after her marriage, grew up knowing their mother as both duchess and educator, woman of rank and woman of purpose. Sometimes on quiet evenings in the library where so much of their reconciliation had occurred, Alexander would pull Charlotte into his arms and thank her for giving him the chance to become the man she deserved. And Charlotte would remind him gently that she had given herself that chance by refusing to accept less than genuine partnership, by valuing her own worth enough to demand he prove his change, rather than simply trusting pretty words. Their story became legend in Derbyshire, whispered among governesses and working women as evidence that strength and dignity could transform even the most painful circumstances, that love earned through sustained effort was stronger than love claimed through easy promises, that second chances approached with wisdom could heal what first chances destroyed through carelessness. And Charlotte, who had once believed herself broken beyond repair, who had learned to survive through necessity and found purpose through suffering, understood that her greatest strength had been refusing to surrender her sense of worth even when circumstances demanded she accept positions that seemed to diminish her. For in maintaining her dignity through adversity, she had become someone capable of recognizing genuine change and accepting love when it finally arrived in trustworthy form. Dear listener, perhaps Charlotte's journey resonates because we have all felt dismissed, overlooked, or forced by circumstance into situations that seem to diminish us, and we wonder whether dignity can survive such trials, whether broken trust can ever truly heal, whether second chances are wisdom or foolishness. Charlotte's story offers no easy answers, but perhaps offers something more valuable: the understanding that our worth exists independent of circumstances that attempt to define us, that survival sometimes means enduring what seems unendurable until we discover strength we did not know we possessed, that genuine change in others must be proved through sustained action rather than accepted on faith, and that love, when it arrives the second time with humility and hard-won wisdom, can be stronger than love that arrived the first time with careless certainty. If this story moved you, if Charlotte's transformation from wounded girl to woman of strength spoke to something in your own journey, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience and redemption. And tell me in the comments what you would say to someone who once underestimated you, for your words might inspire another listener facing similar trials. Remember always that you were never the problem their limited vision was, and that the most profound strength comes not from avoiding pain, but from enduring it with dignity until you emerge transformed on the other side, not broken but remade into someone capable of recognizing your own worth and demanding that others recognize it too, for that recognition, when it finally arrives, is earned rather than given, and therefore precious beyond measure.